Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece is one of the greatest, most ambitious stories ever told. I'm not gonna sit here and say it's the greatest. Without question, everybody can have their opinions, their preferences, it's subjective, but for me, it is definitely one of. I think that you think back to stories of the past, whether it be poems or fables, parables, allegories, or even epics of their time. To today's standards, they are considerably short, often contained within a single volume with no sequel, as they were often told not of rote word, but of oral recollection. People of those times often could not read, and books were expensive and uncommon. In today's world, printing is relatively cheap, the ability to read is widely expected, and the audience is greater than the world has ever seen. In the time of Homer, famous Greek poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, around 1000 BC, the population of the world is estimated in the tens of millions. In the time of the Renaissance, so the 1600s or so, around that time, historical authors such as Shakespeare, Chaucer, Machiavelli, or Cervantes, it's estimated the world in totality had not yet 500 million people. Today that number is closer to 8 billion. And authors today do not just write for their country or for their region, but to the entire world, because the most popular, the most famous stories, they get translated worldwide. Today, the internet exists connecting all of us, or at least the vast majority. Absolutely unheard of numbers, and that number is still growing. The growth of the population and the improved education of that population have brought about a new era of storytelling, commercial storytelling. Back in the day, literature was made not for the purpose necessarily of making money, but for the purpose of expressing ideas. Writing at the time was a medium that was used essentially by scholars, for other scholars, in all fields. It took a very, very long time for it to become commonplace for stories to be made mainly for the purpose of being enjoyed. Just one thing I find generally true about life. If there is money to be made, man will seek to make it and likely succeed. Today's storytelling and the entertainment industry in general, but with the focus on things like books and movies and manga and TV, there's a lot of money to be made. So guys, the age of sequels and never-ending stories has already begun. We are living in it for better or for worse. I really don't think that things like One Piece, as it is, with the popularity that it has, could have existed just 100 years ago. Perhaps what has set us apart from all other beings of this earth is our ability to share information, share knowledge, and learn. Generally in society, the efficiency and skill by which things are created improves over time because we learn from those who came before us, generally as a result of competition between ourselves. Even if it's sometimes slow, I do believe that we are in a constant state of learning. And so various moments or situations or realities shape the playing field in what is possible. But this does not mean that improvement is a constant thing. In general, without looking at specifics, it may seem that way, but typically there exists a trailblazer, a group or an individual who has the right capabilities and talents at the right time in the right environment, who helps redefine how something is done, or who proves that something previously thought impossible or undesirable can be accomplished and widely enjoyed. Storytelling is no different. And I believe that One Piece is pushing these very same boundaries right now. 500 to 600 years ago, man did not know that you could strive to take scholarly literature and make it more enjoyable and more accessible to the common man, and that doing so would become even more popular and successful. Even just 200 years ago, enjoyment of fiction was not widely understood like it is today. Likewise, fantasy and science fiction, as we know it today, was not widely popular until just this past century. You can mark down and observe the stories and the moments which were hugely inspirational to these shifts, which showed what was possible, which today has become popular. But it's always complicated and multifaceted. Being a trailblazer is not always a good thing, and some trailblazing begins and ends with the one person or one moment which allowed for its creation. The reality is trailblazing is risky in that not knowing if it will work, since nobody has done it before, you don't know whether it will fail. You know, we see this with music all the time. It's just an example. Experimental music is trailblazing music, and most of that never gains traction or is outright disliked and determined inferior to present taste. On the other hand, some trailblazing music, which is absolutely different from what everyone is listening to, it does gain traction. It does eventually become popular. Would you believe that there was a time when singers did not commonly use falsetto? Now you hear it all the time. Likewise, because Shakespeare existed, can now others easily and successfully copy his expression? No. Some pillars stand above all others, possibly forever. There exists a complex amalgamation of things in a moment which produce an event that cannot be replicated. Even if someone were to try to equal Shakespeare in this day and age, and I honestly would not be surprised if it were possible. There are 7.5 billion more people nowadays, and I'm sure that somebody is capable of recreating something like Shakespeare. Potentially an equal, maybe even greater than, if that is possible. But the reality is the audience wouldn't care, so there's little point in making something like it again. It's cool. You know, you wordsmith that hard, bro, but I have no idea what you were trying to say, and your story is kind of boring. I think most of us have been there in English class. Shakespeare's expression could only really exist in this one moment of time, even though he trailblazed something that would become wildly popular. You know, guys, I often feel like it's simply a game of following trends, seizing a moment of opportunity before others come. I really enjoy Star Wars, the entire universe. Today it is one of the biggest franchises in the world, but it simply took sci-fi and fantasy, a genre massively growing at the time. It took it to the big screen, movies, where more people were watching. It did not necessarily need to do anything better than other stories in other mediums such as book to now loom over the entire genre. The simple truth is that people in general enjoy movies more than books. So the same story done right in a movie was going to become more popular. This is perhaps a hard pill to swallow, but the very same applies to beloved manga such as Naruto, One Piece, and Hunter x Hunter. Is it a coincidence that three very similar, albeit distinct stories came to be created, became massively popular all within about a 2-year time period? All of these mangakas, in one way or another, saw Dragon Ball trailblaze a certain kind of story that blew up worldwide, and they thought we can do the same thing, but do it differently and potentially better. They took concepts from Dragon Ball they learned or determined as the reason why it was successful, such as the idea of becoming the strongest, or power scaling, or the concept of superpowers themselves, but made it more nuanced. Becoming the strongest becomes becoming the Pirate King, the strongest pirate, or becoming the Hokage, the strongest ninja. And something like Hunter x Hunter takes the ideas of powers and power scaling in something like Dragon Ball and makes it more complicated, nuanced, and gives it more depth. One Piece and Naruto did the very same. Even something like power scaling, in Dragon Ball it took a very tangible and physical form in the Scouter and the power reading. All of these mangakas simultaneously realized that this was incredibly popular and then incorporated it in various ways into their stories. They took the very core ideas of Dragon Ball and expanded upon them. Dragon Ball lacks in plot and character. Let's give it more plot and character. Black and white, good versus evil, becomes black, white, and gray. Or let's take Dragon Ball but make it a bit darker, with more mature themes. The most extreme of something like this being a manga like Berserk. Not to say that Dragon Ball trailblazed all of this exclusively by itself, but it is really the impetus, because it became so worldwide popular and famous. And people sought to understand this and then recreate it. Because at the end of the day, the game is always to make money. Commercialized storytelling. These stories came to exist over a very short time because Dragon Ball trailblazed, and those who read it or witnessed the reaction to it all realized at the same time how to improve it or deliver it to a slightly different demographic. Like it or not, these manga, One Piece, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, exist today because their creators were the right people at the right time and place. And at a different time and place, these creators and stories would likely have been replaced by something else. But let's bring this back to One Piece because this video is about One Piece. Taking in all the conversation that we've had up to this point, I think that there is one area in which One Piece has no equal, no rival, possibly ever again, an area in which One Piece is trailblazing. Whether for good or for bad, we will one day discover. One Piece as a story possibly has the most characters of any story ever. It's obviously normal for a story to create and introduce characters, and when their role has been played, cast them aside as the story continues. Typically, there are very few reoccurring characters, especially over a long period of time, and I think that usually you could count them on your hands. One Piece is something different. The number of reoccurring characters, I'm not going to count, but it's nearing 1,000. And although these characters have different levels of importance, you see most of them again eventually, and there is a place for them in the narrative going forward, even if it's in the background of a panel. I want you guys to appreciate, at the least, just how impressive this accomplishment is. Even if you don't consider it to be a good thing, it's the fact that it is even existing is improbable. It takes a story of the magnitude of One Piece, which hardly ever exists, to even get close to 1,000 reoccurring characters. I'm not out here comparing, I'm just saying, guys, that One Piece is very close to, if not the longest continuous story in all of history, written by a single author. I'm not saying this as definitive fact, I'm not going to look into the details, but it is the greatest, if not, one of that you could count on one hand. Stories this long are not continuous, where each chapter before is relevant and remembered for the chapters that follow. That from the onset, the very creation of the story, it's all been leading to one moment. The end has always been predetermined, and the story constantly depicts the journey towards this end. As far as I know, One Piece has the most recurring characters ever of any story in all of literature within a continuous story without a multiverse, and may even be the greatest regardless of that last caveat. These hundreds, nearing 1,000 characters do something, survive, and continue to exist within the world of One Piece, with updates from time to time, or straight reintroduction of them into the main sequence of events. We have never seen anything to this level before. We know their names, we know something of their personality, their interests, and their history. You guys know I read a lot of Kingdom. Kingdom is perhaps the opposite of One Piece in this respect. On any given battle panel in Kingdom, there are legions of nameless, faceless, practically identical fodder. I want you guys to understand Kingdom still has a lot of characters. But the point is that in the backgrounds of these battles, they're filled with nobodies who die, and as a reader, you move on. These deaths don't mean anything to you. You don't know these people that are being killed, that are fighting, and are dying. At all. I think that one of Oda's goals with One Piece is to create a final battle in which essentially every character in the foreground and background is neither nameless or faceless. A character that as a fandom we may have already grown to know and love, such that the background of this great battle is almost of equal interest as everything else. This feat is mind-blowing. This is trailblazing. Whether this is Oda's great ambition or not, this is how I see the story going forward. This is what all of this seems to be leading towards. Characters in the story of One Piece, they do not die, usually. The Straw Hats make friends of everyone they encounter, essentially, even their enemies. One day Luffy will become the king of the pirates, and the expectation is that essentially everyone he has ever encountered or befriended will be a part of this final battle. On either side, Luffy will have an army of thousands of pirates who we will actually know by name and have distinct appearances, powers, and personality. Thousands. It's actually unbelievable such a thing is even possible. Yet here we are, and it seems inevitable as Oda continues to break his own records by making more. And so some may ask, well, what's the point of this? Why do I care? Well, guys, it's world building. A part that most authors in all mediums avoid to the greatest extent that they possibly can. At least this is true typically, not in all cases. The goal of world building typically is to create an interesting, fictional entity with the illusion of realistic depth. Illusion that the fictional world is actually lived in and that people exist, on screen or not. The goal is not actually to create an entire world, but rather do your best, do what you can to fake it. Because to actually create an entire world is a task that would take way too much time and require way too much effort to actually consider. Although a grading exists, and authors continue to push the boundaries of what was always thought to be possible or realistic. You can take something like Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, another trailblazer, the first one to really create, in, I would say, spectacular fashion, epic fashion, an entire fantasy world that feels real and is incredibly deep. To this day, many stories are still chasing the tail feathers of what Tolkien built. World building of almost impossible levels. Yet we have almost 1,000 chapters in One Piece, and while it is still impossible to create an entire realistic world where literally every person in the entire world is fleshed out and has intricate backstory, it's impossible, right? Oda's taking this as far as it has ever gone. At least when it comes to character. I think that you can argue something like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, in terms of the history of that fictional world, is probably more fleshed out. But the characters, the people living in that world, are not to this level. This is unheard of. Oda is doing something never seen before. We are caught in a small moment of history. But is having a lot of characters actually a good thing? I think that people will expect me to say, yes, of course, One Piece is the greatest and has no flaws, not even potential ones. But most ideas come with both pros and cons. There are reasons to do something, there are reasons as well to not do things. And you just have to choose what you want and what you think is best and go with it. Having this many characters is not necessarily a good thing. The world building is even deeper, but will the people resonate with that? Do they want that in replace of more depth for the characters that we do care about? Do we need more characters to care about, or do we need to care more about the few characters that are most important? The story of Icarus is still relevant today. Ambition is not always a good thing. Icarus flew too close to the sun and got burned. I'm reading Berserk right now, and you guys should totally expect a video on this soon. But the thing about Berserk is that you can count on your two hands the named, personalized, reoccurring characters up to where I'm at in the story. Many characters die. Almost, most characters seem to die. And they do not return. The author does not have to bother with them again except in the recollection of the characters still living. These dead characters, these abandoned characters, their growth stops. Their influence on the world stops. You no longer need to devote any energy to their characters. Having removed this fluff, these unimportant or less important characters gives the author more time to add depth to the characters that remain. This is what I would consider to be more standard storytelling. Following this template, I do not believe is trailblazing. A great number of chapters in Berserk simply deal with the important characters' thoughts about themselves, the world, and events taking place, past or present. Whereas One Piece fans beg for Robin to get a fight or the crew to have interaction, or for characters to get more time in the story, there's just so many characters it leaves room for a lot less in other areas. Meanwhile, Berserk can spend enormous energy to the few characters while maintaining the pace and plot without it feeling too dragged out, without sacrificing enjoyment. I mean, it's a straightforward concept. You have so many characters, it limits how deep you can go for all of them. As well, devoting energy to all of these characters takes away the time available to do many other things. In this way, you could potentially say that Berserk is superior to One Piece, and many other stories as well, but all things have both pros and cons, and your enjoyment of them is subjective and personal. And when it comes to trailblazing, which I believe One Piece is doing with the sheer amount of characters, whether or not it is good or bad is going to be determined when we reach the end. Can Oda manage it? Will his ambition provide the great payoff that we all are hoping and expecting that it will? Or will it just take away from everything else? I personally would argue that what Oda can accomplish with 1/4 the amount of energy is just as impressive, if not, more encompassing. And I want you guys to know Oda does cheat a bit. His characters are slow to change, and he consistently does this, and the world he's built is conducive in this way, because it has to be the case or One Piece with all of its characters just won't work. We've in fact spent hundreds of chapters and are still getting to know many of the actual Straw Hat Pirates. We just had an eye-opening arc regarding Sanji, who he is. This is the evidence. Rather than a more Berserk approach to getting to know the important characters quickly, as a frame of reference and watching them change because of their experiences, One Piece instead does not reveal all the aspects of the character and spends its time, rather than developing these characters, it spends its time explaining them. And Oda also has various tricks in order to establish depth to a character that, truthfully does not necessarily exist in totality. Oda, I believe, is a master of creating the illusion of depth to what is ultimately probably very one-dimensional type characters. Or simply the art of explaining and making the reader understand how deep these characters are with limited time. It's a really interesting dichotomy here of something like Berserk would attempt to accomplish to explain the deepness of a character over a period of 1 or 2 chapters. Oda gets 1 or 2 panels, and he has to attempt to accomplish the very same thing and appeal in the same way. Making that experience enjoyable is an art. Take somebody like Ulti here. I'm not going to sit here and spend 4 or 5 minutes trying to explain Ulti to you, but those who have read the recent chapters, there's a general feeling, or Yamato, you really like these characters. And Oda has built these characters up in a very short time and made them feel interesting and different and a level of deepness. Not everybody can do this. But this is just the genius of One Piece in my opinion. A lot has to be considered for Oda's ambition to yield something enjoyable to read. And Oda's in territory by himself, waiting out to see where he can go and what he can find. One Piece is something different, man. And in respect to this conversation, I think that a lot of criticisms about One Piece are often misplaced because people don't understand what exactly they are criticizing. I have this label on me, mainly from people who do not know me or watch my videos, that I'm a One Piece stan, that I will not ever criticize One Piece. That is not true. I just think that in a lot of cases you need to understand exactly what you're criticizing, why these criticisms exist. If we're going to have these conversations, I want to argue it to the point that we're arguing the origin and not the extraneous things that the origin creates. Robin needs more fights. Sanji's character isn't being done right. I don't care about the scabbards. They haven't had enough time in the story for me to care about them. Why don't the Strads talk more? Why are fights off-screen? Why is the pacing bad? I think that a lot of this is simply misunderstood criticism of the fact that One Piece has so many characters. The criticism itself is a valid one, but the energy is not focused where it should be, in that you are criticizing the sheer amount of One Piece characters. This is the cause, the root of a lot of criticism. And a lot of people really do not understand this, so I am explaining. The reality is, guys, if there were less characters, there would be more time for literally everything else. The biggest of these, we're not going to talk about them all because it would take too much time. Just assume it applies to literally everything. But the biggest of these being the fights. Just to be point blank, there are too many characters to be giving them all fights every time a skirmish happens. And not every fight is important, whether or not you want to believe this or you like this or not. It is something that I do think Oda is trying to carefully manage. If he wanted, we could have at least a chapter per every 1v1 fight in Wano. What would that amount to by itself? Just think about it. 20 plus fights, not including the important ones that take more than one chapter. But, what if characters fight multiple opponents? Okay, and the numbers keep going up and up, and we are only focused on fights. Dragon Ball Z style here, 0 plot, 0 transition, so at the end of the day, Oda has to cut some things. But unfortunately, it is impossible to have your characters not interact with their enemies at all, so skirmishes are inevitable, and Oda's decision is to off-screen fights, or to make them shorter. And this is almost always the choice that he makes when the characters who are fighting are going to fight somebody else at some point in the future of the story. Why was Marco and Blackbeard's fight off screen? Because Blackbeard and Marco are going to fight somebody else later in the story, and Oda's going to devote more of his energy, more of the time in the story to that rather than split it into 2 parts. Why was Aokiji and Akainu off screen? Aokiji and Akainu are going to fight somebody else later on in the story. Why was Sanji and Page 1 cut short? Because Page 1 and Sanji are going to fight somebody else. Go through all of them. This is the decision Oda always makes for the sake of time, because characters feed off of other characters' time in the story. And Oda has to be very selective. Just think about whatever it is that you're criticizing and whether or not the screen time of having so many characters, so many introductions and reintroductions, how that might play a part in it. This, I believe, is the root of most criticism of the story of One Piece. Because Oda is trailblazing, he is doing something different, unproven, that nobody else has been successful at. not to this level. And the truth remains that it is possible for Oda to fail as well, if we are determining failure as a result of less popularity, which not everybody considers to be failure. And just to be frank with you guys, up to this point in the story, Oda has obviously succeeded because One Piece is incredibly popular. The most popular manga ever. At least in terms of volumes sold, given most metrics, or very close. But the task that Oda has becomes ever difficult as the story continues, and we get more and more characters. This is the explanation that I have for what I would call New World fatigue. But I think that people are so focused on what is lost by having so many characters that they don't appreciate the trade-off of what is gained. Now, I'm not saying that you always have to appreciate what is gained because that's subjective, but there is something to be gained, and the vast majority of One Piece fans feel this even if they don't fully understand it, and why it is the case. I think in general, with more characters, you get more hype character introductions. You wonder who they are, what they will do, what their powers are. These are things One Piece fans enjoy and get on a regular basis. These characters can then have the chance of reappearing, just recently with the appearance of Marco. This is something that we also enjoy. It's usually hype. Of course, we've already talked about the world building, how expansive that is, how the world becomes more easily immersed into. These are things that are often now taken for granted, or maybe even disliked by people who actually want other things to be more prevalent. But the fact is that this is a large part of One Piece's identity. What Oda is selling and what we are consuming. I'm not sitting here and saying that this is the right move because there's a reason why it's recommended to do it the opposite way. Fewer characters which we know more intimately. Greater amounts of time spent on their individual stories. I felt that most of the lull people have experienced in the New World is due to the fact that Oda is introducing so many characters. Dressrosa had many chapters dedicated to characters many felt at the time weren't worthy of that time. It was only afterwards that we learned of the Grand Fleet, but I don't think that you can say a Hadruden fight carries the same weight as any Straw Hat Pirate fight, because we know them better and we care more about them. And the fact is that Oda sent half of the Straw Hats away during Dressrosa to manage all the characters. He's very aware of the game that he is playing. But doing this alienates the fans who were looking forward to these Straw Hats playing a more active role in that arc. People were waiting literal years for Sanji's return. Time which allowed them to build expectations, which in all cases was not met. And the same is true of Whole Cake. The Straw Hats, who had nothing to do in Dressrosa, Sans Luffy, got their shine away from the other half of the crew for a time. Oda split them up for the purposes of managing it. What was the reason for this? Why did he feel like he needed to split up the crew? Because he didn't want to devote time to the other half of the crew while he introduced still larger factions. The Grand Fleet, the Big Mom Pirates. And with respect to the Big Mom Pirates, I believe it was always Oda's ambition for the Big Mom Pirates to play a role here in Wano. But to introduce both the Big Mom Pirates and the Beast Pirates at the same time was maybe he considered it not possible or not worth the risk of attempting it. So he instead split it in half, where half the crew goes to Whole Cake Island. There he can introduce all of the Big Mom Pirates. The Big Mom Pirates can then arrive in Wano, and we already know them. He doesn't have to reintroduce them and re-explain them, saving time. Something is always taken as payment for the sheer magnitude of characters. And so when Oda focuses on characters that we do not care about or introduces too many characters at the same time, potentially, what this does is it affects your perception of the pace of the story. Rather than having resolution to conflict and progression of the story, you're almost constantly in setup mode. Because in many cases, such as the Big Mom Pirates and the Grand Fleet, these characters' introduction is not for great payoff in the arc that they are introduced, but in the arc that Oda initially conceived for them all to be a part of. I do expect this idea to slow down now that the Grand Fleet and Big Mom and the Beast Pirates have all been introduced in full, but it took a lot of work to get here, and for us to know all of these characters, for them to play a role in the story, and for, us to enjoy it. And maybe you didn't enjoy it. But ultimately, Oda's goal here is to have a moment of huge payoff now that we have all of these characters. This will, I think, until One Piece hits its final arc, remain something that's value is uncertain, even for those like myself who argue why it's here and what Oda's goal may be. He's got to nail it, and I'm absolutely sure he's trying his best, but as I said, there is no literature, no fictional story in the world that is comparable to this, as far as I know. Oda's ambition is something greater than anyone has ever seen before. There's something about this, though, that I think embodies what One Piece stands for. The themes central to this story are themes that Oda himself is trying to live up to. Haki is willpower. Its literal translation is ambition. In the story of One Piece, ambition is not always met with reward. Many dream of great renown and great accomplishment, but fall short of their lofty dreams. But those that they have met or inspired along the way will eventually pick back up that torch to attempt the same, and possibly succeed where others failed. One Piece is about achieving that which others considered to be impossible. Oda isn't trying to be what came before him. He is trying to surpass his influences and do what has never been done before. He has a dream and he's walking that path as best as he knows how. He believes that he can do it, but he also accepts the risk that the path least traveled is dangerous. I do think that there is something here that moves the soul. One Piece itself, it has a soul, because Oda is pouring his into it with every page. If the story is Oda's ship, with adventure, love, and devotion, he is giving it a life of its own. And when the journey finally ends, we can all cry together about the nakama that we will be losing. And maybe by this time, the story will be able to intimate back to us in whatever way that it can. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for the adventure. In my opinion, the least that we can do is appreciate the ambition. But yeah, guys, that is pretty much all I had to say today. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video, subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.